Hey everybody, and welcome to More Wild Talk. We are with David Russell, which means we are neither more nor wild tonight. So we're just the show. Yes, the Russell Menzenmeyer show tonight.
We're taking over.
We've taken over. We finally made it. No, but I'm excited to have David on. For those of you who don't know, David is actually my father-in-law, Darian's dad. Arlo's new grandfather.
I'm a grandfather.
You're first.
First
time grandfather here.
That's right.
So a lot of wisdom now. You got I
feel so much wiser just in the last week.
I feel so much more tired the past week. So I think I'm going downhill. But anyways, we are glad that you're here. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We are continuing our Promises of God series this Sunday. Tracy brought an awesome message last week for Easter Sunday. And he's going to continue talking about judgment this week. So if that is something that it brings a little anxiety or tension or unknown or curiosity, I think it's going to be a great lesson about a God who judges and how that is actually good news for us, not bad news, how the world often spins that. Yeah. So I'm excited for that. A couple of other things. I know Tracy has his 10 for 10 class starting back up on Wednesday. That's filled up. But if you want to join one of those 10 for 10 classes in the future, make sure you just send an email to the church or let Tracy know. He'll put you on a short list. So when another one opens up, boom, you're right there to get in it. And then just our regular plug for all of our social platforms and things we have going on, liking those, engaging with those, sharing them with your friends. It just makes a difference. It's an easy way to impact the work that we're doing, and we're grateful for you guys for doing that. So tonight, we are going to talk about the purpose of the church. So the reason we kind of like this, multiple reasons. One, our church just finished up a series called Why Church, where we broke down the significance of the church in a world that is slowly losing the recognition of its importance, where less people are going to church. A recent study came out by Barna, and maybe we'll talk about this in a little bit, but over the past year, a recent study showed that 29% of pastors seriously considered quitting ministry completely. 29%, 30%.
In the last year.
In the last year. Yeah. So basically from COVID and the stresses that COVID brought and the numeric decline and the perspective of church, all those things impacted it. And some churches like us are trying to combat that, showing why church is important. And I think tonight we're going to continue that discussion of the purpose of the church. Not being redundant of that sermon series, but maybe giving some fresh insight from David. Now, before we talk about that at all, David, introduce us. What do you do? Where do you live? What's your story?
Yeah, okay. I am the preaching minister at the River Park Church of Christ in Russellville, Arkansas. And yes, our last name is Russell. We live in Russellville.
They named it after.
It was an omen. Yeah. You know, when someone in Russellville is looking for a pastor, you're like, hey, I could do that.
I could do that.
I could do that. And it's got my name. And so we've been there almost exactly the same amount of time that you've been here at Vero, because I think we moved there and moved into our house, and about a week later, Darian and Payton came through with their moving vans.
We saw the excitement.
Stopped at our house.
We want to be a part of that.
Yeah, for a week or so, and then continued here. So right about the same time. So in many ways, we're kind of like at the same place at our ministry in a location. And Russellville is we're Arkansas. It's sort of rural. We're not super rural. I don't know. We're not a big city either.
Sure.
I mean, the church sits right near the Arkansas River, and we have our membership's pretty much divided, about 50% on one side of the river and 50% from the other side.
Pretty compatible or comparable to Vero, it sounds like. Not a city, not rural, kind of a mixture of the two.
Right. We have plenty of amenities, and we have 2 or 3 Walmarts, and we have a movie theater, we have things like that, but we always don't have, y'all have more restaurants here than we do.
Well, it's a tourist town, so
that's true.
People come here to eat and sit on the beach.
But we're right in the foothills of the Ozark Mountains. I don't know if you can call it foothills because they're just the Ozark Mountains. They're not that big anyway, but there's several rolling mountains and things nearby. It is just a beautiful area with tons of trees, tons of water, fresh water, lakes and stuff. Lots of outdoor activities and things to do, and we have lots of young families at our church.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Yeah.
normally smaller churches aren't known to have younger families. And what's the percentage of kids? I love that percentage you always give out.
We're about, it's so hard after COVID and everything. It's like, what is our actual attendance or a number? I don't know anymore. But let's say we're somewhere around the number 120 or so church. Oh man, about 30, 40 of those are kids who are like 11 and under.
Yeah.
I mean, like there's kids climbing the wall.
It's a young church. A lot of young families.
Now, we do have older families too.
Sure.
We have older couples and older single people. But people notice that about our church when they're there. They're like, y'all sure have a lot of kids. So like, well, yeah, we do.
What do you attribute that to? I'm just curious.
I think a lot of it, some of it was it didn't exactly happen with the birth of the church, but the church kind of birthed in a way to kind of branch out and do something new, to be a little more open, a little more welcoming to what we might maybe sometimes call someone like a fringe member of society, a little more edgy and things like that. And I think just that attitude began to attract young families. But I also think a lot of it had to do with inviting. When you love your church, you're like, hey, you're talking to your friends about your church and like, well, maybe we should come too. And young families have young family friends typically, and so they would come.
It's a snowball effect.
And it
come here. There's a lot of kids, and then it adds 7 more kids.
We have a few kids, and now we have a bunch of kids, and now we have a lot of kids.
And now we have a lot of kids.
So it's that kind of thing. That is my best guess, because most of that happened before we got there.
Sure.
But
it's maintained that reputation and that. Well, today we're not talking about that. We're talking about the purpose of the church. We could talk about it, but I'm curious, just straight out the gate, what's the purpose of the church?
I think it really just comes from what I see is it comes straight from Ephesians, and that equipping. That the purpose of the church. Well, here, let me just read it, and then I won't.
You won't butcher it.
I won't butcher it, which is highly likely. But like from Ephesians chapter 4, I got to go with the whole glasses so I can see what I'm actually reading. Like verse 11 through I think it's like 16. So I'll just read this. Yep. Christ Himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers. So He gave all these types of people, and then He says what their purpose is: to equip His people for works of service. And I mean, you could just stop right there. Equip the people for works of service. And then it's so that, what's the works of service for? So that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. I'll try not to get too preachy here, but I think just in that sometimes we go quickly to this idea about faith and about knowledge, and that's where we spend a lot of time. It's like, well, no, it's like actually the service is the thing that brings us to knowledge, because like when you experience something, you can read something in a book all day long, but when you experience it now you know it like on a whole nother level that you'll like live, if that makes sense.
Well, that's I know I've heard it said before, you go in for a serious surgery. Who do you want to operate on you? The bookworm who has read every book,
been to every class,
and passed every test, and
did the simulator 5,000 times,
knows it all, or the guy who's been doing it for 30 years, that surgery, has been in there. Which one do you want? You want the guy who has
surgeon.
The experience more than the knowledge.
Right. It goes on, verse 14, then it says, we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here or there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful schemes. And again, that kind of hooks onto this knowledge idea, but instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of Him who is seated, who is at the head, that is Christ. From Him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love. Get this part, as each part does its work.
There it is.
The work, the equipping for work is the primary function of the church, in my opinion. I mean, it's like, what else do I say about it?
No, that's great. I remember teaching on that passage to our youth group one time, trying to get them to capture the idea of, teacher, evangelist, pastor. What is the reason that there's so many lists here? Am I supposed to be all of these things? And the way I made a comparable thing for them is like, imagine when you go to an escape room. And, think of all the people that are in an escape room. You have the guy who's opening every clue and it's just like boom, boom, boom. You have the guy who's reminding everybody of the time. Hey, don't forget, we got to get this done. You got the one who invited everybody to come, is taking pictures. You have the one who's motivating people. Like, hey, it's okay. Like, do you want to get involved in this? I see you're over there by yourself.
You're standing there by yourself.
Like, everybody kind of has a role, but the team gets the job done.
Right.
And they all have their own purpose, their own reason for being there, the thing they're better at that they naturally do. And I think that plays a little bit into what Paul's saying here.
Absolutely. 100%.
That the church is made up of a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds with a lot of different purposes and passions and skills. But when all of those people come together, and the purpose of the church is for the unity to work towards the mission, right?
Yep.
The purpose of the church is for that group, that body, to work towards the mission. Tell people about Jesus. Lead people to Jesus.
There's a little book. I love it because it's little.
Sure.
And it's short.
Easy
to read. By Tom Rainier, called "I Am a Church Member." And actually, I just did a series on that right before I came here.
Perfect.
And like what you described was the very first lesson, this idea of being a functioning member. That every member has a function. That Christ, that God has given you some kind of skill, some kind of quality, something about you that you should be functioning with in the church. Because, like I go on to all the other ones too, but sometimes we kind of like forget that church is not here for me. I mean, it is. It's kind of like this yin yang kind of thing. It's like the primary purpose of the church is not to serve my needs. And not to make me happy, and not to make me feel good, and not to give me a meaningful place to go on Sunday morning, whatever that is.
Which we forget in a consumerism-driven society.
Right. We want to go, and that's why we pick our church. That's why there probably are so many churches, because it's Baskin Robbins. There's 31 different flavors.
It's
Netflix.
You just
scroll through. I like that one. Right?
Exactly.
And I'll go to that one. We'll try a few of them, and go nah. I like this one. And sometimes what we're doing is we're just basing it off of our consumeristic attitude, right?
Our preferences.
And Paul, or not Paul Rainier. Who's Paul Rainier? I think I'm thinking Paul Revere. He's the guy that rode the horse.
Tom Rainier.
Tom Rainier said in his book, he says, the inverse or the opposite of what healthy church membership is this idea of a country club membership. Country club membership, how does that work? Well, you pay your dues, and what do you get? You get access to the golf course, you get access to the pool, you get access to the lounge or the restaurant or whatever.
There's an identity marker. Oh, I go to that country club. I get a shirt, and it's on my car.
But as long as you pay, you get the amenities. And that's country club membership. And sometimes we can fall into the trap of thinking the same thing about the church. I've been in this church for 20 years. Okay.
So I have a right.
So I have a right to have things a certain way, or I give more money than anybody else does. Like I pay my dues, therefore I should get whatever. And church just really isn't about that. And I think that maybe some of it happens when we in some ways kind of like over focus on Sunday morning, because the service that we do in the name of our Lord is way, way, way bigger than the church service we go to on Sunday morning. The service we do in the name of our Lord, following His identity and following His reputation, is how we live our lives, how we treat our neighbors, how we treat the people that we run into, how we interact. And so, again, it's back to the skill thing. So when the church comes together on Sunday morning, we look at that and we say, we're going to worship, or we're going to church. It's like, well, worship, Paul would talk about worship is like how you live your life.
Yes, exactly. Worship is not something you do, like you go and you attend. Which is how we I'm going to worship, and that's where I do it. Like it's in that box right there.
In that hour or hour.
In that hour.
Yeah.
But Paul would say worship, like you said, it's a practice of life.
Right.
It's a lifestyle. It's a worldview. It's how you treat people. It's how you interact in this world.
So when we come together on Sunday morning, the purpose isn't just worship. I think the church would be better served if we see Sunday morning as it's this time to strategize. It's this time
I like
to strategize, like how am I, how are you, and how are we as a group going to worship the Lord in our daily lives by the way we live it.
When we leave this room, this auditorium, this hour that we come together, which is great. I mean, this isn't a bash on weekend worship. That is a huge moment, especially participating in the reflection of the Lord's Supper, singing and lifting up praise to God. This isn't a bash of corporate worship. This is instead saying, and I love that, strategically looking at, whenever I leave this room, my worship continues. Like my relationship and the mission of God, it continues outside these doors. So what am I doing here to prepare me for there?
Yeah, and prepare others.
Yeah.
You know, the first thing on there was being a function that Tom Rainier talked about, was being a functioning member. So everybody has their function, whatever that may be, and there's a million of them. You know, you could be and it's not just isolated to what happens in the building.
Yeah.
You know, like we think about like the person who says the prayer, the person who teaches a class, or the person who leads worship, or works the AV booth, things like that.
Yeah.
But it's also the encourager. Like if you're an encouraging person, being encouraging is important. And sometimes we do need to be fed. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes when we come to the corporate gathering, we might be in a place where we need to be fed. Well, we need to be encouraged.
You can't always expect to pour out unless something is being poured in.
Right.
Like a teacup only has so much liquid before it's empty.
Yeah.
So you have to pour in, and worship can be that. But sometimes people are filled by listening to music, and they do that throughout the week.
Right.
Sometimes it's spending time with their family, and they really connect with God. Maybe it's prayer time every morning, and they connect with God.
Yeah.
So then when they come to the assembly, sure, they're being filled, but they're also able and capable to be poured out.
Right.
But like I said, there's seasons when, I need to be poured into.
Right.
I lost a loved one. I'm struggling with my job. I'm, self-doubt or depression, and I need to be poured into.
Yeah.
So it depends on the season, but I love what you're saying, that, and it goes back to the conversation with Paul and the different roles, is worship, participating and serving in worship. And now we're talking about in the building. It's not just to the people who have the role and who have the t-shirt. Everybody participates in worship.
Yes.
You create the atmosphere. You create.
And participation is not just observing.
Right.
Just soaking it in.
Culture isn't created passively. It's created by actively doing something. Like you create the culture of your church, of your, the body of believers there.
Right.
If you want to be a part of a welcoming church, you have to be welcoming.
You have to be welcoming.
If you want to be a warm church, you got to be warm. You got to be loving. If you want other people to show Christ, you have to show Christ.
Yes. If you want your congregation, if you want your church to be a gathering of people who are joyful, you spread the joy.
You got to be the joy giver.
You got to be the joy giver.
You got to be the peacemaker. You got to be the loving, the one who's sacrificing. Like, you got to be those things. So before we go too far off that, I want to go back to, how does this again connect us to the purpose of the church? And specifically, I want to look at, and we're going to run out of time soon, but the purpose of the church and how the outside world from the church, their perspective of that, and the interaction.
Yeah. Do you have an idea? Because I'm hearing your question. I'm going, well, that's pretty much what we talked about.
Yeah. Sure.
That is, it so much has to do with that equipping element. It's equipping people to live a life that reflects Christ. It's about equipping people to also to be able to tell others about Christ. Because sometimes you become a Christian, and sometimes you're a Christian for a really long time, but you're kind of like, but I don't really I don't know how to talk to other people about Jesus. So equipping people in that way. I think just any way you can think about equipping, but that equipping is more than just knowledge. We already talked about that. It's more than just knowledge. It's equipping in a way that leads to some kind of action. Yeah. Now that action's not always visible. Yeah. It's not always the get up in front of church, talk, do something person. I mean, it could be, if you're a very prayerful person, then becoming more intentional about your prayer life and more intentional about what you're praying for your church, praying for, one of the things Tom talks about in that church member is praying for your church leaders. Yeah. I'll put a plug in here for pastors, for Payton and for Tracy, that these people who work at your church need encouragement. Because it's like if Tracy and Payton are always pouring into the church, you got to ask yourself who is, and I'm not saying no one's doing it, but who is pouring into them?
Yeah.
If I'm always pouring into my church and no one's pouring into me, I'm going to run out.
Yeah.
I'm going to be empty, and I'm like, just that's why people do vacation and things like that. Some of the other things in there, I'll just tell you real quick, was being a functioning member was the first one. The second one was being a unifying member.
Yeah.
So always working towards unity. That part of the lesson was like not gossiping, but a unifying member is one who helps. So you see an opportunity to help. You see someone who has a need, just jump in there and help them.
Yeah.
Even if you don't have a clue what you're doing, even if it's not your favorite thing, help them for at least for a few moments. Helping, also being a forgiving member, recognizing that we're all human, therefore we're all flawed, therefore we're all going to make mistakes and say and do stupid things.
Yeah,
I do them all the time.
Oh yeah, totally.
But what?
I
but be ready to forgive. We all want to be forgiven.
Yeah.
Therefore, we should be ready to and eager to forgive. One of my favorite ones was chapter 3 or 4. It's like not letting my church be about my preferences and my desires, and that can be a hard one, especially. It's a good way to check yourself. If you're frustrated that things aren't the way you want them to be, you might ask yourself, do I have a country club mentality of what the church should be? Because I paid my dues. How come it's not the way I want it to be? Praying for your church leaders. The church, the devil's always setting traps. Paul talks about some of his letters that, the devil's setting traps, but he really sets traps for leaders.
Yep.
Because if he can take out a shepherd, then the whole flock's open season, right? And so he really aims at them. And that's why leaders need even more prayer. Yeah. And then the last, or the one before that was before the end was, I will, as a church member, I will not just raise my kids, but I will lead my family. I will lead my spouse. And that's not just a men's job. That's spouses working together, leading their family, leading their children, leading each other to be healthy church members. Yeah. So encouraging them in those other things too, like asking, talking to people in your family. Well, what's your, skill, or how are you serving?
Yeah.
Are you a functioning member? And
not expecting our children to identify and worship God the same way we do.
Right.
That they're different.
I know in that lesson, one of the things I talked about is one thing we don't need to do, we really do not, we need to fight very hard against this, is we do not need to raise a generation of churchgoers.
Sure.
I think some past generations, and I'm not necessarily picking on anybody, but I think that's part of the struggle of the church today is some past generations primarily raised churchgoers. Yeah. Going to church is what was important. Right. And it's like, well, no, living for Christ is what's important. It doesn't negate Sunday morning, but
a committed relationship with Jesus, that's the mission.
Right. And it just changes the whole focus of Sunday morning.
And the attendance and church on Sunday morning, that is the way, the means to it. I mean, that is a step towards a committed relationship. Right. But you can go your whole life and never actually follow.
Right.
You can,
And the very last chapter was to, as a church member, to cherish church membership as a gift, and to think about, I told the story about this bicycle I had when I was a kid, and how I just loved that bike. It took me all kinds of places, and I remember washing it like my parents would wash their cars.
Nice.
I'd flip it over, and I'd grease the chain, and I'd adjust the brakes, and I just loved that bike, right? And so that's how we treat gifts that we really cherish. We take care of them, and we look for areas where maybe something's not doing as well as it could be, and we try to lift it up and make it better and make adjustments and things like that, and that gift will continue to serve us over and over and over again if we will cherish it and treat it like something that we cherish. So I think all that just kind of really goes in this bubble of like, if you had to ask me to say it in one sentence or just a few words, the purpose of the church is to equip the people for works of service. now that balloons into like, what does that look like?
Our whole
and
conversation.
Our whole conversation.
Yeah, and I think that was the point of my question is, we have to, in the church, reevaluate what is the purpose of the church. And then we also, we want to change. And
constantly reevaluate.
And then we also need to help the world understand the purpose of the church. What do we want them to see when they see the church? These aren't just people who gather once a week and sing some songs and then go home and live a life like the rest of the world. Yeah. These are people on mission for Jesus. Yeah. That's what we want them to see.
And many times I think, and I've said this several times at my church, I'm not sure we need more knowledge.
Right.
As call it the people who have been part of a church, maybe raised in the church and things like that for a really long time, we probably don't need more information. We need more action. Yeah. We need more, boots on the ground.
Or at least we need a greater balance between those two.
Yeah. We're not going to stop teaching.
Sure. Yeah.
We're not going to stop teaching, but sometimes we know plenty enough.
Yeah.
It's not complicated. It's not rocket science. Yeah. It's be the hands and feet of Jesus.
Yeah. But if we truly didn't know, it would lead us to action.
Yeah.
If we fully appreciated it.
Absolutely.
So, well, David, thank you so much for all of that. The purpose of the church, folks. I mean, there it is. So we are grateful for that. And again, grateful for all of you for joining us. We hope that you have a beautiful rest of your Thursday night, a beautiful weekend coming up, and we will see you on Sunday to continue our Promises of God series. See you then.